Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to another deck mod tutorial. So today we're going to be talking about using stamps to edge our decks. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of stamps, and then I'm going to go through a tutorial on how I edge my decks, as well as how I do some of those antiquing or kind of distressed looks on the side of my cards that a couple people have asked how that process works. So before we begin, let's kind of talk about the benefits of stamping. So stamping is in general more forgiving than markers or any of the other edging techniques because it has a longer drying time, which means you can generally wipe that excess away. I like stamping, particularly for doing the metallic colors, because the metallics are really quite gilded looking. These Brilliance stamps are wonderful for that. They give you a really rich, kind of shimmery effect to your cards. The other benefit of stamping is that it allows me to do that antiqued look. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about a couple of the drawbacks of stamping. So with stamping, sometimes it can require more than one coat. Now this is also true with markers. It's just true with any sort of edging. I haven't found that too often with these really liquid-based or really wet metallic colors. But with the distressed inks, if you want really dark color with the distressed inks, it's going to take multiple coats because that's actually not what these inks are meant for. They are not to be full coverage. They're meant to add an aged look, which means they add texture and color, but they don't fill. The biggest drawback to doing stampings is that it does have a much longer drying time, so you're not going to be able to use your cards right away. You will need to set them aside and give them ample time to dry. If you start stacking them up too soon, they are going to stick, they are going to bleed, and it's going to make a mess for you. So the process for doing just a basic one layer stamp is pretty easy, and I'm going to roll up my sleeves a little bit here. And so basically what we're going to do is we're just going to take our stamp, and you can pull this little with these metallic stamps, at least with these Brilliance ones. I like to just pull the cap off so that it's out of my way when I'm doing this. So the process is really easy, probably easier than doing marker because it's a lot more forgiving. So basically I'm going to take the card, and it really doesn't matter because we're going to, oh look, I got paint on the back of that. Because we're going to wipe off the excess anyway. It doesn't really matter which way we face the card because this is going to run over and you will see that. So real easy process here. We're just going to take and run this along the edge. Get those corners good, run it around. Run it around and around again, and there you can see we have our edging. So as you can probably see, I have overflow on the front and back, which I don't want. So at this point, I'm just going to take my shop towel and I'm going to very carefully run it along the edge and wipe that excess off. So you can see we still get the color, hopefully that's showing up on camera. We still get the color on the sides, and I've just wiped that excess off the front and the back. And you can always double check. Sometimes you get a little bit of residue on the back. You just kind of wipe that excess off. It's better to do it now than before it dries. So there you go. So, and then we just start making layers of them, setting them aside here, as we're gonna leave lots of time for these to dry. So there we go. So we've done a couple of those in the metallic. So let's talk real quick about a couple of the most important lessons when it comes to just doing some basic stamping. So the first thing is that just like with the markers, you really need to practice because you need to understand how this ink is going to affect your cards, how it's going to bleed, how fast it dries, which also means how forgiving it is. You just need to make sure that you give it lots of drying time. Another important lesson is that you really do, just like the markers, have to do one card at a time. If you try to just pick up a deck and just run this stamp across, which you will actually see me do when I switch over to do the antiquing, but that's a little bit different. But if you pick this up and try to just run this across the whole stack of cards, you're gonna get bleed all in there and it's gonna be a gigantic mess. So just take the time to do it one card at a time. You know, look at it as time spent with your deck, and it's a really great bonding experience. So we've done a few of the cards here, and I just wanted to go ahead and show you how that coppery stamp turned out. So you can see here I've got a very nice copper shine on the side of these cards. Isn't that just beautiful? So you can see when I stack them up here with some of the white ones, you can see that that really does make a huge difference. So now that we've talked a little bit about just stamping in general, and we've taken a look at how we go about doing that, let's talk a bit about my antiquing technique, because that is, I know, what a lot of people have asked to find out more about and how I do. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll show you some of the antiquing techniques that I use, but I also encourage you to, be creative and try your own. I definitely recommend getting a cheap pack of playing cards to practice with, and this will allow you to not only practice some different techniques, but to try out some different styles to see what you might like. So you can see here, I don't know if I've shown this, I can't remember if I showed this in another video or not, but these are all of my sample cards that I have done. This whole front end here, for the most part, is stamping. So this is, some of the metallics and some of the distressed inks and that kind of thing. So great idea if you're going to be trying this, and especially if you're going to be doing some different techniques. It's a great idea to give it a try first on some sample cards so that you can see how it's going to apply, how it's going to look, what colors you might like, and then you can use those to compare to the actual card deck and see how that color scheme is going to line up for you. So the one that I get asked about, I think the most, is the technique that I used for my angels and ancestors. So this is actually marker, which is this yellow mild liner. Whoops. So this is actually this yellow mild liner as a base with the tea dye stamping rubbed over the top of it. So I'm going to show you how I did this one. So real simple, we're just going to take our marker here, our mild liner, and we're going to lay down our base coat. So we're going to use the distressed ink. So this is really technical, really fancy. I take my finger and I just dip it in on the pad, and then I'm just going to lightly rub it along. I like to do the corners darker, that's just my preference. Rub it along the edge. Now when you're doing a deck, you can go ahead and do, when you're doing just rubbing with the distressed ink, you can do a chunk of them at a time, and I usually do. I don't like to do the whole, rub it along the whole thing. I like to just do it in sections, and then that gives you that variegated color that you see in the deck. So real fancy, real technical. You could probably use like a paper towel or something, but I just find that my finger works better. Sometimes I like to darken some of the corners more. So that's really all there is to that one. So we get just a little bit of the distressed look on the edges. So the next technique I'm going to show you is just this, another sort of aged technique. It's really basically the same process. How your aging turns out is going to depend largely on the type of base coat you use. So whatever color you use for your base, that's going to determine the varying shades of your stamping overlay, because depending on how light or dark your base coat is, and depending on the pigment, it can change, the color. So let's do this green instead. That green color. And we're just going to take our vintage photo, and basically it's just the same process. We're going to take a grouping of cards, and when I did this one, I just took, like a handful of cards here, and did those, and then another stack and did those. So I'm just going to take this, and I'm going to very lightly rub this on. Now start lighter and go darker. You can always add, and it's really hard to take away. And hopefully you can see some of the distressing that we've got going on there. My camera is having a really hard time focusing. Yeah. So that's the basic technique. So the next technique I want to show you is another one that I get asked about a lot, and this is my Delos tarot, and it has the darker edges just mostly on the corners. So again, this is another technique that is just laying down base color and then adding your black over the top of it on those corners. So let's just grab a Crayola here and do a couple of these. Okay, so there we have our base color laid down. Just got a nice pretty pink there. So now we're just going to take our black distressed ink and the same process. So again, we're just going to take our finger and we're going to rub. The other thing I'm not showing you that I do generally do is, and only for time's sake, is that generally after I would do a section of the deck, I would take the cards and I would wipe off that excess that might end up on the corners. I haven't been showing you that just for time's sake, but you should do that. So after you do a chunk and you rub it with any of these additional colors and you're adding that distressing to it, just go ahead and wipe the excess off, because you can get a little bit of runoff between the cards, especially, you know, because you're pressing down and you're pressing into it and that ink is going to go in between those cards. So even though I haven't been showing that to you, I might want to make sure that I mention that you do need to do that in between your sections. So here you can see that I just got that black edging just on the corners. And you could do it darker or lighter depending on what you're looking for, and that's what gives you this effect here. So the next technique I want to talk about is adding the metallic overlays to the top of your stamps or markers. So this is my Chrysalis Tarot, and I have edged this one in the tea dye stamp. So I started with my base as a tea dye, again 2 coats to really get that color saturation in there, and then I have overlaid with just a light wash of it this Brilliance stamp, the gold stamp. And it's basically the same technique we just did with the distress stamps, only we're going to use the gold. I did want to give it a bit of a shimmer, so that's where I overlaid the gold. And you can see here is a little strip where I got a lot of gold right there, and that's okay. So it just gets mixed in. There you can kind of see it shimmer. So let's take a look at how we do that. Okay, so for this sample, I'm actually going to, rather than do the stamping, the tea dye stamp like I actually did on the deck, I'm just gonna run a base coat over the cards and then add the gold so that we can really see that transition. So now we're just gonna take our stamp pad here, and the important thing to remember when you're using these more liquidy or these wetter inks is that a little bit goes a really long way. So start really light and add. It's not like the distressed inks. These will provide full coverage. So you need to go light and then just add to it. Now, if you want that really dark look, hopefully I might have picked too dark of a color. If you want a really dark look, you can full on wipe it over the top of it. So I'm gonna do that here in a minute. This one I'm just gonna add a little, we're gonna just do a little sparkle on this side. So that adds, I might have picked too dark a color, but you can see there is shine and sparkle to that now in places. So then we'll just go ahead and run it over the top of it, so you can see that is also an alternative. And you can just take your stamp and just run it over the top lightly, and you will get a much fuller coverage rather than the spotty coverage that we had before. But yeah, it kind of picks it up. So you can see now I have kind of just a glittery overlay with that teal underneath. Some places it's more gold, some places it's more teal. It just kind of depends on the technique that you're looking for, and this is why I say it's important to test first. So if I'm doing an all over wash with the gold, and again, don't forget to wipe off your excess. It's wet. It will run, it will stick, and you should be letting these cards dry pretty well before stacking them up, unlike what I'm doing here. So just so you can see, it is important to note, which I will show you here in just a second, that when you start mixing your stamps like this, you do have a possibility to get some bleed over into your stamp. So I now have a little bit of teal in my gold stamp. A gold overlay over our teal cards. So, and I could have made the gold darker, I could have made it lighter. It's all about, technique. It's all about how you want it to look. So this is why I say it's important to go ahead and sample it all before. So there we have a look at some of our stamping techniques. So we have doing just the plain metallic, and then we have talked about doing some of the more antique style or vintage look on the edges. So I hope that you found this deck mod tutorial informative and maybe a little bit entertaining. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.